Welcome to Community for Pittsburgh Gardening. We've taken over Frisbee. We're going to talk about our garden, give you a quick tour, talk about some things, and then we're going to go back inside so we can actually be on the computer, and we'll answer questions. So if you have questions about our garden, hold them until we're done. And then we have a couple things to talk about, like if you're growing things specifically and you want to know about them, ask questions about that. So think about questions you have for when we're done with our tour. And then when we don't have any questions to fill the rest of the time, we'll talk about some things that we had planned about, mostly small space gardening, how to make the most of the space you have and stuff like that. So anyway, we can get started with our tour.
Okay.
All right, so over here we have a bed of gooseberries and currants. So I think we have 4 gooseberries and 3 currants. They're both black and white and thick and red currants. And the gooseberries are like 3 or 4 different varieties. So I kind of just try to choose one of each. So unless there's a reason to plant more than one, like for pollination, I try to plant one variety and then a different variety and a different variety so that I can have different things. So those are currants. So they're forming little currants now. So every single one of those flowers will be a currant come a month and a half from now or something like that. Also in this bed, so I think, yeah, these 3 are down here are currants too, and the gooseberries are at the front. So gooseberries are good if you don't have a fenced area, because deer won't eat them because they're super spiky. They're also kind of like a niche plant because most people don't grow them, but that's why I like them.
They're very like tart.
Yeah, they're very tart, but they make good jellies and pies. They're pretty common in the UK, but not as much here. Over here in the other L section of the yard, we have lots of raspberries. So there's 7 kinds of raspberries, 5 kinds of red raspberries, 1 kind of gold raspberries, which are these here, and then 1 type of black. So again, I just tried to pick different types that we wanted to try. If you have a small space, raspberries aren't probably the best for it. Certain varieties can be grown in containers if they're big, but really raspberries spread pretty heavily. So if you plant them in the ground, you'll have to deal with them coming up. If you want to keep them contained, you just have to cut them back pretty heavily. So these will give us raspberries for all of summer. And they just came in sets of 5. So that's what we have, 5 of each kind, because that's how they come. And then they put up new shoots. So this is this part of our garden. And then our main part of our garden is over here. So we have a 4-foot high fence around this garden. It's about 25 by 60, I think. And it has 10 beds. Most of them are 4 feet wide, because that's about the distance you can make them so that you can reach both sides. So if you make a bed too wide, you have to step in it to get what you want in the middle, which isn't really the best, because then you compact the soil. So we made them as long as we could still have space. Most are around, I think they range from 18 to like 22 feet. So on the left side, on this side, we have this whole bed is just asparagus. So asparagus is a perennial, meaning it comes up again every year. It takes a while to get started. So for the first 3 or so years, you don't actually pick it. You just let it get real strong. And then for the next probably 20 years, it'll keep coming up every year. Comes up really early in the spring. So you pick it until maybe June. And then you can let it get really tall, like this one is here, and it stores energy for the next year. So this year was kind of weird because we had a hard frost in like the beginning of May, which is like not usual for Pittsburgh even. So the ones that are all fallen over are because they got frosted. They'll be fine. I mean, it doesn't matter. But some new spears are still coming up, so that's good.
This will be like fall fill.
Yeah, they get to be about 6 feet high probably, and we have to kind of rope them in so they don't fall into the rest of the garden. The next bed over is planted with corn on the far end, which you can see coming up. And it's also planted with okra, which hasn't come up yet. Okra loves warm weather. So we planted it kind of early and it frosted. I think the seed should be okay, but I mean, if they don't come up, we could plant it again because really you can plant it as late as June and it loves really hot weather. Most people think that it only grows like in the South because it's common there, but it'll grow here just fine. It just likes it when it's hot, which Pennsylvania is actually pretty warm in the summer. So along the back, we have one rhubarb, a huge rhubarb that we actually moved from another spot. So we put it here. And then we have some grapes along the back, which are tied up on these wires. Yeah, some are dead. So we planted 9, I think, but only a couple survive. Some look good. Some are still pretty small. I'm going to rip some of these out probably that died and put more fruit trees here or something. But so they're tied up because if you don't tie them up, they just trail along the ground. And this lets you cut them and manage them correctly so that you can hopefully get grapes. These two beds, long ways, are just tomatoes. I just planted these on Saturday, just why I had leftover tomatoes that I gave some people, got some, which is cool. There's 50 tomatoes here. Tomatoes are actually pretty good for small spaces. They grow fine in containers. We have a space to just plant them this far apart. But yeah, if you are planting them outside in the ground, the key is don't put them too close together. So the last year I planted more than this, but we're probably going to get more fruit this year because they're further apart. And also when they get a little bigger, I'm going to put these stakes in. I just cut these inside with wood that I had left over, but you just stick a stake per tomato plant so you can tie them up to it because it's important to keep your tomatoes tied up for indeterminate varieties, which means they keep growing forever. They'll get like 10 feet tall, but you want to make sure they're tied up and then cut them when they're about 6 feet tall so they don't just, so they put more energy into producing fruit rather than growing big and tall. So this is chard. It actually overwintered because it wasn't that cold this year. I think chard is a biennial, so it will go to seed this year. We could save some of the seed, which is kind of cool. We also have peas planted in this, some of which have gotten eaten, but they might come back. And these trellises here are actually, they're from Tractor Supply. They're actually like feed panels, but they work well for this because they let you have the peas or anything that's climbing grow on those, but yet plant stuff underneath them. So only a little bit of the bed is planted with peas, but you have another 3 feet that you can put stuff. Usually we put shade things like lettuce or chard in this case, or whatever else that when the peas are more luscious, it doesn't really matter that they get shaded a bit.
Yeah, last year the peas grew like up and over the top of the trellis, so they get really big and bushy.
Yeah. Next bed, we also have trellises. These are for cucumbers. I did plant those. Again, they're a warm weather thing. They haven't come up yet. We also have some kale or something here, which got eaten. And more lettuce and stuff. So I just kind of scattered seed underneath these panels because I had extra. So most seed packets for like lettuce and kale and stuff come with like 300 seeds. I mean, and they only last a couple years. So in this case, they were like a couple years old. I just figured, hey, I'll just scatter it around and see what happens. So you can see we have some like leaf lettuce over here. And in this case, I didn't even care about rows. I just threw it down and we'll see what happens because I had to throw away the seed anyway. The next bed is not planted. Those are potatoes, actually. They're we planted potatoes like 2 years ago, and they're still coming up. So I may leave those or may not. I think I put some melons in this bed, but again, yeah, we grew cucamelons up this trellis. And if you have a small space, like the roots of these plants don't take very much space. They just take a lot of space growing when they grow big. But if you trellis them, it's these vertical space that you can use rather than horizontal space. So you can trellis pretty much any melon, even if it grows like a big cantaloupe or something. You just have to make sure you kind of support the fruit when it gets big. So you can use, I've seen people use pantyhose. I've seen people use like netting, so you can actually keep it on a trellis if the trellis is sturdy enough. Further along, we have more cold weather stuff. Mustard greens here are already going to seed because it was cold and then it was like 80 degrees. So they're like, oh my gosh, time to flower. We have orchard and I think beets and carrots in rows here. And these are beans. They're coming up. So these are just bush beans. So they get about 2 feet high, maybe not even 2 feet. So these are yellow and purple, like waxy bush beans. The next bed is just strawberries. So we had 2 types of strawberries, pretty much split right in half. I forget which kind they are. The bottom half didn't do quite as well, so we may have to rip out some of these and either plant more or plant something else, but whatever. Those also came in like packs of 25, so they're not too expensive. So you just plant as many as you can fit or as many as you want, and then if some die, it doesn't really matter. And then this far bed, again, I just scattered some seeds. There's lettuce, there's some fennel, I think, or dill maybe left over from last year that went to seed. And that's it for inside the garden. Oh yeah, all the strawberries are blooming. I don't think there's any strawberries yet, but lots of flowers, which means there will be strawberries. And these kind will send out runners, so they like duplicate themselves. So you can actually like keep your bed going by like taking those and like rerooting them and stuff. And strawberries are good to grow in containers as well. They actually make like strawberry containers, which are like multi-tiered and stuff, so that they can like trail down. But even just like a pot like this would work. Yes, that's the pot. Out here we have 10 types of blueberries. I think there's actually 5 types, 2 of each type. And these are planted in containers. So blueberries don't have super deep roots. They just they kind of spread out widthwise. So as long as you have even shallower than this would work. These were just as wide as we could find. So something shallow and wide was best for blueberries. And planting them in containers actually works well because they like acidic soil. So you can actually put soil acidifier in for the blueberries, so that if you planted them in a bed, you'd have to do the whole bed. But in this case, you don't have to use quite as much because there's not as much soil. So yeah, each one of those flowers will be a blueberry. And blueberries are good for this zone, good for Pittsburgh in general. And all these are like hardy. You can grow these like in Maine. So they tolerate frost just fine, and they're delicious. All right, this bed is all peppers. So I think there's like 52 peppers in here or something. Most of them are shishitos because we really like shishitos, but there are some regular bell peppers and some hot peppers as well. This bed is it's I think 9 or 10 eggplants. They're all the long Asian eggplants that we usually use for stir fries. And then peppers beyond that. Maybe, like 8 more peppers here. And I'm not positive what kinds these are. I labeled them when I started them from seed, but I don't really care right now. So when they come up, we'll know. And this is garlic. We planted this last fall in October. You plant the garlic that, in our case, that we grew the last year. So we store some of it for the winter and through the spring. And in the fall, we take I don't know, maybe 60 cloves or more and planted them here. So that comes up in the spring. And then these are all hard neck garlic, so they'll have scapes, which will come up that you cut off, and you can use those too. Then once the leaves die back, we'll dig them up and eat them and plant them again. So garlic's pretty good because you can just plant it forever, as long as you get the harvest, which again, it's pretty easy to grow. It's very cold hardy. So here we have some horseradish, which we've actually never used, but we have been growing it now for like 2 years. It grows really well all the time, which is cool. But we'll actually have to try to dig some up and use it. It's kind of like a weed, so it like kind of just like spreads and goes where it wants to. So I have it in this bed with like this divider. It's a good candidate for growing in containers as well, so it doesn't take over your entire garden. And these are some more peppers that I didn't have room for anywhere else. I just threw in this bed. So that's all the veggies we have, but we also have fruit trees. So this is an apple tree. It's a dwarf apple tree, meaning it's not really gonna get much bigger than this. And if it does get taller, you can just lop it off at the top and it'll grow a little more bushy. We have 3 apples up this side and 1 cherry tree. This little one is a cherry tree. I just planted it last year, so it's small yet, but it did flower this year quite a bit, so we might get some cherries. And then there's 2 more apple trees. And we actually have 4 peach trees in the back, in the very back, which are actually pretty big now. We should hopefully get some. Oh yeah, we can go walk back there and see those too. Most everything else in the front, we do have some more apples, but everything else is, well, it's either an herb, so like a low ground cover herb like thyme, oregano, sage, things like that that are perennial, that just come back every year and have been getting bigger since we planted them, which are kind of cool. And we have lavender, that's lavender. Some different kinds of thyme. A non-edible plant, but it has a flower, so it's cool. Yeah, lots of oregano. So we use this all the time in cooking. We just come out here and like grab some thyme or something to cook with. We use rosemary a lot, so we planted that last year and it actually overwintered this year because it wasn't very cold, which was cool. It died the past year, so interesting to see that it survived this year. Most everything else in the front is just ornamental, not for eating, but looks nice. So between our 2 fenced areas, one for the dogs, which have the raspberries, and then our actual garden, there's a path to the back. And then back here we have the 4 peach trees I was talking about, which really are only 2 years old, but they're already pretty huge. These actually aren't dwarfs. These are standard trees, meaning that they will get bigger than this, though I actually cut them off at the top. Like I said, you can do with apples. You can do with any fruit tree to kind of just keep it contained, keep it so you don't have to get a big ladder to pick the fruit, which is good for a home orchard. I mean, the idea here is not to get like the most production. The idea is so that I can pick it without falling down the hill off a ladder. So
question from Sam. We have to move
no, I planted them however far apart I planted them, and that's how far apart they'll be forever, because they, like, you can't move them once they're established. I mean, you could, but they'd probably die. So I actually just pruned like between them. So I pruned heavily here so that they don't overlap. And I pruned less heavily when they're facing out. Yeah, there's little peaches. There's peaches up here too. So they're a little fuzzy. That's cool. I haven't seen those yet. So there you go. Yeah, there's lots. So we should have lots of peaches. And then we have 2 more cherry trees back here, which are kind of just sticks right now. But again, they're pretty young still. And we have some Egyptian walking garlic, or walking onions. Sorry, yeah, walking onions. So they actually get these bulbs at the top, which will flower, and then when they get really heavy, they fall over. And when they hit the ground, they actually will seed. So that's why they walk, quote unquote. So they could they spread that way. If you don't want them to do that, obviously cut them off. You can use every single part of this plant. So you can use this leaf like a green onion, and you can use the actual bulb part as more like a traditional onion. And we have our compost piles back there. We haven't really done much with them. We just kind of throw food scraps in mostly. But yeah, we haven't really gotten too much into composting, like turning it and stuff and making it sure it's super hot and making sure the ratio is right. But it's just a place to throw scraps, which is not in the trash, which is good. So.
Question about the panels and a question about the irrigation.
Great. So those panels, I assume you mean the panels for that things grow up for trellises. I got them at Tractor Supply. Some Tractor Supplies don't have the 8-foot panels. They only have 16-foot panels, which are just unwieldy. But the one I think in Murraysville did have 8-foot panels, so we got those. I think the longer ones are called feed panels, but these are actually called utility panels. So I think they're like 4x4 squares, 4-foot by 8-foot utility panels. And the other question about irrigation, how much do they cost? I'm not positive. I think they're like probably less than 20 bucks. I'm not sure. You could also make your own with like fencing. So if you have leftover fencing from fencing a garden or something, you could stake like a wooden frame around it and see about that. Up here we have 4 more apple trees. So apples are all dwarves. They're all different varieties, but with apples you have to be sure that they pollinate each other. So different apples will bloom at different times, and except for like 2 varieties, they need another apple to pollinate them. So in this case, this one here is an Arkansas Black. It blooms very late, so you have to have another apple that's blooming at the same time so that it can have cross-pollination. I think Granny Smith will self-pollinate, so you don't have to worry about that, and something else. But in this case, you have to make sure when you get them that you look and see what the recommended pollinators are. And for peaches, you don't have to worry because they're self-pollinating. All right, yeah, so that's pretty much the whole garden tour. We can go back inside, get on the computer, and we can answer more questions. But yeah, while we're doing that, I can talk about irrigation. So we just use drip line irrigation. I set it up last year. There's 3 rows per 4-foot bed, and it's, I think, a 1 gallon per hour emitter per every 18 inches. So you could talk for an hour about drip irrigation, but like Kelsey's dad could definitely talk for an hour about drip irrigation. But you pretty much run a hose or a line out, and then you have a timer has different things you connect to it. So we have 6 zones. So like 4 beds will make up 1 zone, and then the next 4. So you can run it for like 30 minutes. And then that will be a certain amount of gallons that you put into the bed. Then you could run zone 2, which is your things that need a bit more water. So you might run that for 45 minutes and stuff like that. So they are actually built-in drip emitters to the lines. You can get like just drip hose, which you just connect to your hose and just turn it on, which is the easiest way to get started. But this actually does have like a timer, and we ran PVC pipe for the actual line to out there, and then there's solid line with no drips to go to each zone and stuff like that. So
Where did you get the trees and the babies?
So we got the trees. I got every single tree from Stark Brothers. Starkbros.com, I believe, is the
I'm showing this.
is the link. They were bare root trees, meaning they didn't come with a root ball. They just came with a stick and some roots at the bottom. And they were probably 3 feet tall to start with. So they were babies, I guess you can call them. I think they grown for about a year at least beforehand. And all the bushes like raspberries and gooseberries and stuff I got from Norse Farms, it's called. They have a bunch of, and the blueberries. So anything that isn't a tree, pretty much I got from Norse. they have good prices, and they've all been pretty good so far. Yeah, and my parents just got 18 apple trees for land that they have, and they got them from Stark as well, and so far they've been good. As to Jed's question, the deer do not eat the blueberries. Birds do eat the blueberries, the blueberries themselves. So once they actually start producing fruit, we're gonna have to net them. So it helps if they're close to each other, which they are now. So we'll just throw a net over them, and hopefully that'll stop the birds from eating them. Yeah, the deer don't really care. The deer don't eat peppers, eggplants, garlic. Sometimes they'll eat tomatoes. This time we didn't plant any tomatoes outside the fence. But the reason why we didn't do that is because all of they ate the actual tomato parts, not the plants. So the plants survived, but then they came and just launched the actual fruit. So we didn't get many tomatoes from there. But yeah, pretty much anything in the nightshade family, which is peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, I think to potatoes as well, but they don't get eaten really by deer very much, or mostly any other animals. So that is good.
That's it. Thanks. People have more questions.
Yeah, so if anyone else has any other questions.
Good question.
Cool. So we actually we didn't fertilize last year at all. And we still had pretty good like yield. We could probably look into that more. I know each plant likes certain things and stuff like that, and there's different things you can do, which is why crop rotation is kind of, people say it's important. Like, peas give nitrogen back to the soil when they grow, which is cool. And many other plants use nitrogen. So if you plant peas one year, you can plant something else which uses nitrogen the next year and move your peas over, things like that. I think soil amendments I did for the blueberries, like I was saying, because they enjoy acidic soil. So I think it was like a rhododendron and blueberry acidifier to keep the pH about like 4.5 to 5. But other than that, I haven't done anything to the beds. So we got when we made these beds, we put a mix of 60% topsoil and 40% mushroom manure, which is like a byproduct of when they grow mushrooms. So it has different amounts of nutrients and stuff in. So instead it's not just soil, it kind of keeps it a little looser. And then what you can do is if it settles down, you could like add just mushroom manure to the top, which keeps it a little looser. But as far as but there are good organic like fertilizers. The place I get my seeds from is called M.I. Gardener. He has like a all-in-one fertilizer which you can use on pretty much anything, which is organic, which people seem to like. I haven't actually tried it, but could go with that. If you have any recommendations, Robin, you can please share.
How early you start?
So
we should show them our little.
Yeah, we can show them our grow thing downstairs. So we pretty much start planting, I would say 8 weeks before we plan to plant things out. So for tomatoes, it could be up to 10 weeks. Really, I'm not great about keeping track of exactly when I should start things. I think we started early March this year, and I planted seeds in little pots. They were like 3-inch pots, and I planted a couple seeds per pot. So by the time they grew, there were multiple tomatoes in each pot, but it didn't really matter because I was going to take them out soon enough. If you were gonna start them earlier and let the tomatoes get like as big as a Home Depot one that you find that's like 3 feet tall, you'd have to up plant them or up pot them to larger pots. But I don't really feel like doing that, so I start them as seeds early March. Put them under grow lights. We have grow lights downstairs with a rack I made, which we can show, and then keep them watered in the tray. That lets them grow for 6 to 8 weeks, and then you can harden them off, it's called, because since they grew inside for their whole life, they don't really know what it's like being outside. So you have to take them out a couple hours a day when it's not too hot or too cold, let them outside, then bring them in for overnight when it's still like freezing or whatever and very cold. Do that for about a week, and then then you could leave them out. In this case, luckily I looked at the weather and saw that in the next week it was going to be 26 degrees in that one day in May, so I actually didn't plant them out. Usually last frost in Pittsburgh is early May, or even or late April. This year was pretty late, so I think last year we had them planted at that time, but it's a good thing we didn't because they would have all died because tomatoes and peppers can't deal with super cold weather. Many other things out there like peas, you can plant peas mid-March as long as the soil can be worked. Most seed packets tell you when you can plant, and it's like as soon as soil can be worked in the spring, which means if it's not frozen, you can plant it in the ground. It might not come up if it's too cold, but it's not going to hurt it. Yeah, so we can go downstairs and show our seed starting area in our laundry room. The classiest place to keep your seeds. So these are herbs that have went to seed, but pretty much we have two different racks with 2 levels each, and then we have these LED 45-watt grow lights, which I got from Amazon. So we turn them on, you can see that they're pink, and that's because plants only really care about light in certain spectrum of visible light. So these are the ones that they mostly care about for growing as seedlings. If you're trying to fruit plants or grow marijuana, you have to do a different like UV, like different amount of wavelengths. But for this, just for starting things or for growing like lettuce or things that don't fruit, these work great. So they kept things, nothing really looked too leggy this year, even with planting multiples per seedling tray. So here are the sizes I used. So I think they're, I don't know, 2.5 by 2.5 or 3 by 3, and they just fit right in here like this. So you can fit 18 or whatever in this, and then you can just water this whole tray and it just soaks it up from the bottom, which is nice. Yeah, and we could actually plant more of these herbs. Now that it's time to plant outside, we can just plant them outside, but we actually had these growing in like early January. So I planted these just long before I started actual seeds. So I planted basil, parsley, cilantro, and stuff like that, just to use in cooking. So even if you don't want to have a real garden, if you have like a window that gets a decent amount of sun, you could just really take a cup, put some potting soil in it, put some seeds in, and you could have herbs as long as you keep planting them, let's say every month or something, because they will go to seed. All herbs will go to seed. That's just how they are, even if you keep cutting them back. You could have herbs to use for cooking, which is kind of nice. And basil, you can actually cut off and reroot. We have some that are rooting now upstairs, which I cut off these plants. But it's nice growing things from seed. It's way cheaper because seeds only cost $1 for 100 seeds, whereas you buy a basil plant for $3 or whatever. It takes a bit more time and more energy, but you can have way more for the price. So yeah, so here's the basils that we started earlier, and they're getting pretty tall and leggy, but you could take some off and root them like I did there, or you could just give up on them and plant new ones outside.
All right, we have some questions.
Okay, some more questions.
Okay. Foods you'd recommend for a space covered in shade by tall trees?
Yeah, so definitely depending on how much sun your space gets, that determines what you can plant. So if you can figure that out, it's best to like look through the whole year and see like when things get sun and when they don't. So maybe in winter things don't get that much sun, but in spring through fall, as the earth moves relative to the sun, it gets 4 more hours. Great. So there's different, you can look it up online. There's just different, what it means to get full sun. It's usually 8 or more hours. There's like part sun, which is like 6 to 8, part shade, and then full shade. So those mean different amounts. Those mean different things, and it'll give you like a list of what you can grow in each. but pretty much anything that doesn't fruit. So tomatoes, fruit, they actually grow fruit and you eat that. Anything where you actually eat the plant itself, like lettuce, chard, kale, um, sorrel, and any greens pretty much you could grow in almost, I would say, I wouldn't say full shade, but I would say part shade. So if it gets like 3 hours of sun a day, you could grow lettuce, no problem. To grow fruiting plants, they're going to say that they want full sun. So I would say at least 6 hours of sun per day. If they get more morning sun than afternoon sun, that would be okay. So if they get 5 hours, but they're in full sun from the time the sun rises until noon or whatever, that would probably be okay. But yeah, I would recommend things that don't fruit you could grow, and that's why herbs are so good. Herbs will pretty much grow anywhere. I mean, half of those herbs we grew kind of just seeded themselves and they're fine. But if you want to grow any fruit trees or bushes or stuff like that, they're going to recommend full sun. Though some of the apples we have aren't probably in, though they don't get 8 hours and they're still doing fine. They probably get 6 or something. So, and that's an average throughout the year. Like in midsummer when the sun's the highest, they probably do get 8, and then late fall they probably get 5 or something. So, and really I would just try it out. So bush space that's very small, what's recommended to grow. I would definitely recommend herbs, especially because you can grow those inside without any problem if you have a window that faces south here. Yeah, herbs, and yeah, right. And if you're trying to get things for cooking, definitely herbs, because most recipes you can add an herb and it will taste better than if you didn't. So other than that, small spaces, lettuce you can grow in containers easily. If you have the sun, you could definitely, and you like tomatoes, you could get a tomato plant or two. They grow fine in containers. Up, you don't even need a too big of a container, maybe like a 6 or 8 inch pot. As long as it's deep enough, it should be fine for a tomato. If you get a little less sun and you still want to grow tomatoes, I would recommend cherry tomato, because they don't take quite as much energy to make small tomatoes as it does to make like a big heirloom tomato. What else could we grow in small spaces? You can pretty much, I mean, you can pretty much grow anything as long as you, right, it depends on how much you want to grow of it. So some things, it's not really useful to grow like 1 or 2, but in most cases, things that fruit like peppers, it usually is. So like if you want to grow one bell pepper plant in full sun will produce probably 20 to 30 peppers throughout its lifetime. So that'd be enough. I mean, shishitos, I just say any hot pepper variety, like shishitos is a hot pepper variety, even though they're not really hot. Jalapenos, they produce hundreds of fruits per year. So if you have one jalapeno plant, you get 100 jalapenos, not all at once, but throughout the year. So you could use those. So you'd only need one if you were eating for one person or something. Bush bean varieties. I don't know the actual names of them. I think we just had like a purple waxy one and like a yellow one. Unlike tomatoes, I don't really know that they have like names, like fun names that I know. Yeah. But I can send you the ones that I grow that I've liked, the purple and the yellow ones, Robin, and everyone. And we had green ones. Yeah, they're just like green bush beans. I haven't actually grown any beans for like saving. So some beans they grow in pods and then you eat them when they're, any shelled beans. I haven't grown those yet, but that would be cool. But haven't done that. Christy's question. Yeah, you can pretty much, Pittsburgh soil is not really bad. I mean, if you actually care, you could get a soil test done. So that tells you what nutrients are in the soil, how much percentage of, phosphorus, nitrogen, things like that. If there's any like contaminants and like hard minerals and things that would impede growth. The only reason we did a raised bed Oh yeah, was that we actually wanted to, our soil's pretty clayey, so we wanted to make sure that we had good soil to start with. Um, so we put in, I don't know, 10-inch, 6 to 10 inch beds and filled them with soil so that we would have one, contained plants, and two, that we could control exactly what the soil was to start with. Um, in Churchill, I don't think the soil's probably as bad as maybe in the city. But the reason we did it well, and because we planted those peppers over where we cut down trees, so there were pine trees there before. You can't really plant right on top of wood chips or trees because they take all the nitrogen and there's no soil there as much. So we needed to have those beds be a little higher so that we could actually plant stuff there. Yeah, so we do have to keep picking our peppers for them to continue fruiting. Not as much as cucumbers or something like that. So if you let a cucumber get like really big and yellow, the plant will just say, "Hey,
I'm done.
I'm done." Yeah, because the whole goal of the plant is to produce itself for the next year. So if it made a viable fruit that has seeds, it says, "Hey, I've done it." Picking peppers does make them fruit more, so it makes the plant more prolific, I would say. So if you pick them regularly, as long as they're like ready, then that's better than waiting 2 weeks and then picking all of them at once, rather than going out every couple days and making sure that, hey, I have 3 jalapenos that are ready, let's pick those. And that's why we have more than one plant. So if you have 10 jalapeno plants, you can get, 10 jalapenos from each plant, then you have enough at one time to make something with. Yeah, you can store, or whatever. Uh, Rhubarb, our rhubarb's been growing probably 3 years. That one we moved last year. So we moved it like 3 or 4. That was the only,
From the old house.
right. Yeah. Well, yeah. One of those moved from our old apartment and it was in
A bucket.
a bucket for like 6 months, and it somehow survived. I guess it was pretty, I don't know,
Party.
hardy. But yeah, now that it's this big, it probably won't get too much bigger than this in the space that it's in. Plus, we should probably cut it and use it. But it's probably been growing 3 years. When they come, they just come as little crowns or little small ones that you plant, and then you can use it as soon as it grows, but you don't want to cut it too much so it gets established. So when tomatoes are small, you probably want to water them, I don't know, I would say every other day if they're in full sun consistently, especially depending on how much soil they're in. Um, but once they're established, tomatoes are actually okay with drying out a bit. The goal of tomatoes, though, is to not let them get super dry and then super wet, because if they do that and they have fruit on, that fruit will get too much water at once and then they'll crack. So cracked tomatoes happen. And sometimes you can't help this because it doesn't rain for 2 weeks and then it rains 3 inches at once. If your garden isn't covered, like there's no way to stop the rain from going into your bed, which is, I mean, which what you want in most cases, but for tomatoes, some of them will get cracked. So consistent watering is good, but maybe once they're established, maybe 3 feet high or whatever, let them dry out a little bit. You don't want the soil to be consistently wet because they don't like to be wet. The roots will rot, but they should be consistently watered when they're young so that they establish.
Did you want Robin to talk about?
Oh yeah, Robin. Oh, Robin knows lots of things
Robin
about
knows
gardening and
things.
soil, which is sweet. So yeah, Robin can talk about
Yeah, please.
lead in Pittsburgh soil.
That's You guys know way more about like vegetable gardening than I do, but I've been to a lot of things about like city soil and lead. There's, I guess, just like a couple things. If you're growing in like, if you're in the city, soil lead levels can be pretty high. You kind of want to consider, one, where the soil is. If it's like under something that was painted, like old, it might have like paint shavings in it. Lead in soils typically comes from like old infrastructure or old buildings or fill or things. Like ambient levels aren't that high, but so it can be very like spot specific. If you're like right up near a building, you're more likely to have higher lead because it'll come off windows or things. Most of the lead that ends up on vegetables actually comes from splash from the soil. So one thing, if you do have a spot that you think it's kind of out in the middle of the yard or it's not near a wall or under a stair or fence or something, definitely make sure to mulch, because when the soil dries out and rain hits it and it splashes up, that's actually how a lot of the lead will get onto food crops. So things like tomatoes that grow up and fruit above the ground, you don't have to worry as much as like leafy greens. You definitely don't want to grow like root vegetables right into city soil unless you've tested the soil and know for sure. And then, I mean, those are probably the big ones. If you are worried about lead, you know, get a test done. They're like $10. You can get them done at Penn State. If things open back up, the Allegheny County Conservation District in Pittsburgh sometimes does free lead screenings, where you just take a little baggie of soil and they have like an X-ray gun that shoots it and bounces, I don't know, it's science, and it tests the lead in like 5 minutes if you just go to one of their things. But yeah, then if you are growing, I'd say I would recommend, you know, tomatoes or things that are above ground, and then make sure you mulch really heavily so you're not getting that splash. That's the basics.
Cool. Thanks, Robin. Oh, that reminded me that like for watering tomatoes, same idea. So when you water tomatoes, you don't really want to water the actual plants themselves if you can help it. So not because of lead in this case, but because the more wet the leaves get and stay wet, they're much more prone to becoming diseased. So that's why drip irrigation is so good, because drip irrigation just puts the water right at the roots, which is where the plant wants the water. So not to mention, if you water the whole plant, it's kind of wasting probably half the water, because none of it makes it, most of it doesn't make it to the soil to soak in. But definitely for tomatoes, if you can help it, especially if you only have a couple, like it's worth it to just take the hose if you're watering or watering can and just put it right at the roots and just water those only. So because of diseases, and because if you water from the top, I mean, it can splash things from the soil onto them, which apart from lead will have, just can make them more diseased. And another thing with that is you want to make sure there's no leaves touching the ground. So tomatoes grow really tall. The only leaves that you really need are at the top. So the ones at the bottom sometimes will just turn yellow, and you can just take those off. And even if they don't turn yellow and they're like within 10 to 12 inches of the ground, you can just take them right off, because they're just not really doing anything. And the only reason that they would just be detriment, like there's only a detriment if it makes the plant diseased. So yeah, and we can talk about like single staking, like tomatoes, is that you have to like prune the suckers if they're an indeterminate variety, which pretty much everything I gave to everyone and that you would buy are. Though it will tell you if you buy a plant, it says determinate or indeterminate. If they're indeterminate, prune off the suckers. So anywhere there's a leaf, it kind of looks like this. The stem's here, the leaf comes out like this. There's a sucker, that's Kelsey's finger right now, coming out. It looks kind of like an armpit. I always thought it was an armpit. So you like take it and just snap it off. If it grows too long, you can just cut it. So what that actually is another tomato plant trying to grow. So if you don't take it off, the plant will put more energy into making another tomato plant rather than giving you fruit for your existing tomato plants. So we do have some zucchini and squash planted that hasn't come up yet. We usually have a couple. We like to grow patty pan squash, they're called. So they're like circular, about this big. They kind of look like UFOs or flying saucers. And they're a type of summer squash. You cook them up zucchini. They're just, but any zucchini, squash, you can grow. It does take up a bit of space because they really like to grow large. So if you're going to plant more than one, don't plant them too close together. And you can grow it in the container. Just expect it to like trail out of the container, and then your fruit will probably actually be either on the ground or your deck or whatever, because it kind of grows where it trails. Was there anything else? We don't do anything special for them. You can trellis them.
Is that better? Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So you could take them and put them on a trellis to grow up either on your deck or outside. As long as you like, you might have to tie them to the trellis because those, unlike like cucumbers, don't really have coily things that grab on. So you might have to just thread them through the trellis or like take them on. Yeah, so there's different, yeah, to Svetti's question about plant eating bugs, yeah, there are quite a few of those. Usually we plant enough things that it doesn't, if some get eaten, it's not a problem. We haven't really had too much trouble. Young things that are in the chard or kale family sometimes get little holes in their leaves. I haven't actually figured out what exactly it is, but if they make it past being, you know, a couple inches high, then they just keep growing. So it hasn't actually killed many of those plants, but the chard kind of looks really bad for the first like month, and then it grows and it looks totally fine. So I'm not exactly sure, but other than that, our raspberries sometimes get Japanese beetles. They're pretty common. I'm not sure. There's not really any way to stop them. You can kind of just pick them off. The best way is to pick them off. So look every once in a while. If you see some, put them in, like, take them off, put them in soapy water or whatever.
We have more problems with animals.
Yeah, we have more problems with actual like larger animals, which is why there's tons of deer here in Churchill. So we have each tree individually fenced for fruit trees, and the garden fenced with an electric fence too. So that keeps the deer out fine. We've had some trouble with groundhogs getting under the fence, so we've had to put some bricks down and stuff to keep them from digging under. But if you can keep, and our garden's pretty far away from our house. If you're growing like on a patio or something, you probably won't have this problem. Groundhogs are pretty skittish. So the further away from your house and from dogs and stuff like that your plants are, the more you have to worry about pests that are like deer or other animals. So if you're going on a patio, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if you have like a real garden, like that you probably want to fence it or grow things that those don't want to eat. So like peppers are grown outside the fenced area. They're totally fine. So yeah. The boxes do not have bottoms. So they are just walls pretty much. So we built them with extra lumber we had around and some lumber we got from Home Depot because we needed more. But they're just, sometimes they're stacked on top of each other, and then each corner has like a 4x4 that are just screwed in with deck screws. So we just took them, we actually built them in place because they're pretty heavy, but if you were building a smaller one, you could build it like in your garage or something and then move it, set it on the ground. And in our case, we didn't even do anything with the grass. So this was all grass before. We just left the grass. If you're worried that you're not doing a deep enough bed, if you're doing a pretty shallow bed, you probably want to either kill the grass first or put down cardboard on top of the grass, then put your soil in, because that will kill the grass. And then that if you're growing on a patio, you're probably best to just do containers so you can move them around, and because they're a little deeper. But I wanted our plants, especially the ones that have deep roots, to be able to go down into the existing soil, which is why they wouldn't have bottoms, and it's not very flat, so we had to kind of just make it work with what is what we had. But yeah, there's no reason to put a bottom on it unless you're putting it somewhere like on concrete or something. Yeah, so yeah, if you have the actual space with soil underneath, I wouldn't put a bottom on it. But if you want to grow on a concrete area and you want an actual bed, you could either do a raised one, so you could put it on legs if you wanted it to be higher, which I've seen for more accessibility, or just because you want it to be higher, you could put it on legs and then have like a bottom and then your walls, or you could just put it on the ground and make it pretty high. You just want to make sure the things you're growing don't grow too deep. So like if carrots grow 10 inches long and they hit the concrete, they're not gonna grow as well. So cool. Well, thanks for your questions. That was good. I like to talk about gardening, so we could talk about gardening. But yeah, send us all your questions about gardening if you have any more. But I hope people can use the plants that I gave them, which is, and if you have any other questions and want to get into gardening more, it's super fun. You can pretty much put as much effort or as little effort in as you want, which is why it's kind of great. You could grow one plant and be happy with that. You could grow 50 plants and still want to grow more. What you could put lots of money in, you could put no money in. It's pretty much whatever, and you can do it forever. So it's pretty fun. Yeah, well, I hope everyone enjoyed it. Like I said, yeah, send Christy money so that she can have a job and Ultimate can exist again, hopefully soon. But in the meantime, do some gardening because it's socially distant. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a good night.